Hi, I'm Cilliers Brink and welcome to the Inside Track. There's been an outcry in the past week over the controversial Firearms Control Amendment Bill. It aims to ban the ownership of firearms by civilians for self-defense. The reality is that South Africa is a murder rate that resembles a low-scale civil war. Disarming law-abiding citizens is reckless because, as it is, we don't have a police service capable of protecting us. Today, we interrogate this move by national government and we look at how you can get behind the DA campaign to protect your means of self-defense. But first, we have a look at the week in headlines.
Former SAA chairperson Dudumeni has been testifying at the state capture inquiry via a virtual link.
She didn't show up this morning as she'd been told to do.
Ms. Meni seems to be running circles around the Zondo Commission of Inquiry.
Calls are mounting for Health Minister Willem Tshepi to step down. An internal probe has found that a multi-million rand contract between the Health Department and communications company Digital Vibes, linked to Mkhize's longtime associate, was in fact irregular.
The post office will be cutting down a number of its outlets by merging some post offices across the country to cut down on its overhead expenditure and running costs.
Former President Jacob Zuma has finally appeared in court to face corruption, money laundering and racketeering charges.
I plead not guilty.
The country's unemployment rate has reached a new high at 32.6%. More than 7.2 million people are officially unemployed.
Cabinet has therefore decided that the country should be placed on adjusted alert level 2 with effect from tomorrow.
This week in the headlines, President Ramaphosa holds on to his lockdown powers. Mounting calls for Health Minister Willem Tshepi to step aside over the latest COVID corruption scandal. And, no surprise here, the ANC and the EFF agree on radical changes to the Constitution that will impact property rights. But first, former President Jacob Zuma has finally pleaded in court to charges of corruption related to the arms deal. Since 2014, the DA has fought to have Zuma prosecuted, and in 2019, we finally won our case, compelling the MPA to do what it should have done years ago. For a man who's supposedly desperate for his day in court, Zuma has managed to stall things for more than 15 years. Of course, he'll continue to try and stall and delay, but we believe that the balance of forces, to use the ANC's language, has finally turned against Zuma. The DA looks forward to seeing him in criminal court on the 19th of July. Dit blyk nou dat die ANC bereid is om radikale toegewings aan die EFF te maak om artikel 25 van die grondwet, die eiendomsklausule, te wysig. Oppervlakkig beskou was daar aanvanklike verskil tussen die ANC en die EFF as dit kom by privaat eienaarskapregte. Die ANC en sy apologete hou vol dat hulle nie die nasionalisering van privaat eiendom ondersteun nie. Hierdie was nog altyd die EFF se beleid. Maar onder druk om die 2/3 in die parlement te kry om artikel 25 te wysig, blyk dit nou asof die verskille tussen die EFF en die ANC verdwyn het. Beide partye bepleit die sogenaamde state custodianship van eiendom. Hulle wil ook die jurisdiksie van die howe inperk as dit kom by die bepaling van vergoeding. Hierdie ANC-EFF koalisie van korrupsie moet gestop word. Anders lyk Suid-Afrika se toekoms soos die van Zimbabwe en Venezuela. Die DA sal aanhou beklei om die grondwet en privaat eiendomsregte te beskerm. Talking about state custodianship, the South African Post Office has announced that it will close 130 branches across the country. Whatever else it does or doesn't do, the Post Office is an essential part of the social security network in this country. Millions of South Africans, especially folks living in rural areas, depend on the Post Office to receive their monthly social grant. As with schools and hospitals, it is the poor who will bear the brunt of the continued mismanagement of state institutions, and this includes SAA, Eskom, and now the Post Office. Is there anyone left in the ANC who can still say with a clear conscience, my hands are clean? Last week, it emerged that Health Minister Willem Tshepi is implicated in the awarding of a dubious 150 million rand communications contract to close associates of the minister. These services should have been provided and could have been provided by the department itself. So now the man entrusted with the responsibility of managing our vaccine rollout is himself implicated in a corruption scandal involving public money. The The DA has called for Minister Mkhize to step aside, to allow investigations to run their course. We need leaders who are beyond reproach, and Minister Mkhize is no such leader. So President Ramaphosa has moved us up to adjusted lockdown level 2. At least he's not banning alcohol sales or closing beaches, you might say. But the bigger issue is this. For more than a year, South Africa has been governed under a national state of disaster. Even if adjusted level 2 lockdown is not as bad as it could have been, the government hasn't given up on any of its devastating lockdown powers. Neither has it conceded that the Disaster Management Act should be reformed to ensure that Parliament can review lockdown decisions and regulations, and that the public is consulted about measures that ministers now simply take with the stroke of a pen. This is no way to run a government in an open and democratic society, which is why the DA has gone to court to invalidate parts of the Disaster Management Act. This remains an enormously important case for the country, and we await the outcome. And finally, it is tragic that the unemployment line grew even longer in the first quarter of 2021. Stats SA revealed our expanded unemployment rate now stands at an alarming 43.2%. It is devastating that over half of our country cannot get work or has given up on even finding work. This highlights the urgent need for job-friendly policies that only the DA can deliver. In the spotlight this week, with a spike in the murder rate and police services that admit that they don't have the capacity to protect everybody, should government be banning self-defense as a reason to own a firearm? Let's take a look at the story in the spotlight.
Gun owners are furious as government revealed proposed changes to the law that would remove self-defense as a valid reason to own a firearm.
There are an estimated 4.5 million licensed firearms in South Africa, and the vast majority of those are kept for self-defense purposes. The call for comment on the proposed changes to the Firearm Control Act will see firearm licenses no longer being issued for self-defense purposes.
The invitation for public comment on the draft Firearms Control Amendment Bill was released on Friday night. The public has until July to comment.
Police Minister Cilliers says the rationale for the amendments is to stop firearms getting into the hands of criminals. Girls on Fire, which helps women lawfully license themselves for self-defense, says this could be a major blow in the fight against gender-based violence.
The prospect of taking away my ability to protect myself and my family is actually quite a scary proposition.
I just think it's absolutely crazy that we have a right to life and now we have no way of protecting ourselves.
I've been a victim of 2 attacks, and if I didn't have my gun with me, who knows what might have happened.
It bewilders the mind to think that they would want to disarm us.
With our country's high crime rate, self-defense is the last line of defense for millions of South Africans. But now, national government is trying to disarm licensed, law-abiding citizens through the new Firearms Control Amendment Bill. It aims to ban ownership of firearms by civilians for the purpose of self-defense. This is among other limitations on firearm ownership, which would affect hunting and sporting and even the private security industry. While the SAP's budget for visible policing is being cut by 3.8 billion rand, VIP protection has been increased by 26 million. Who do you think the ANC really cares about? The DA stands in strong opposition to the gun bill, and over 55,000 South Africans have already joined our campaign to take a stand by signing our petition at stopgunbill.co.za. The bill doesn't tackle the real problem of the high rate of violent crime in this country. It merely aims to disarm licensed, law-abiding citizens. This is reckless, and it leaves civilians with their hands tied behind their back when facing criminals. To discuss all of this and more, we're joined in studio by the DA's Minister of Police, the Shadow Minister Andrew Whitfield, and on Zoom, spokesperson for Girls on Fire, Tshepi Mmekwa. Welcome, Andrew, again to the Inside Track. This has been an incredibly emotional issue all of a sudden. Private, licensed, lawful gun ownership. tell us, how did we get here? Take us through this gun bill and its implications.
Well, it's been a long time coming, and you're absolutely right. It's an incredibly emotional issue for millions of South Africans who rely on their firearm as their last line of defence, as you said and put it absolutely correctly. It's emotional because people believe they have a right to self-defence, quite rightly, but they also have a constitutionally enshrined right to life. And they believe that their firearm is that last line of defence to protect themselves, their families and their property, which is really the constitutional mandate of the South African Police Service, and they are failing to uphold that mandate. So the DA has been monitoring this for some time. We've been waiting for this bill to come, and we've prepared ourselves really well. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank, it's now ticked over to 60,000 signatures on the petition this morning, and to thank all of those people who've signed that petition for putting up a fight against this incredibly draconian piece of legislation.
So it will affect, obviously, lawful licensed firearm owners. But what about the private security industry?
Well, the limitations for the private security industry in terms of the bill will be the number of firearms that they may possess, the kinds of firearms they possess. And we saw the very famous social media incident of the cash and transit heist, and the ability of our private security industry to defend our property, our cash, their own lives by having access to the right weapons, because the criminals have access to some incredibly powerful weapons, automatic rifles, semi-automatic weapons, and this bill would place the lives of the private security industry and ordinary South Africans at greater risk of violence by violent criminals.
So, Andrew, let's look at the state of police, because if the government says that we can't have licensed, lawful, private protection, firearms, then we are completely dependent on the South African police. You have been quite vocal about a number of issues affecting the police. What is the police like? What are we entrusting ourselves to?
Well, I think the first thing I always like to say is that there are some incredibly hardworking and honest professional police officers out there. And, Minister Tshepi often says, no, it's just a few rotten apples. But unfortunately, the entire barrel is rotten, with a few apples that are not yet rotten. And so, it's the opposite of what Minister Tshepi actually believes, is that the barrel of the South African Police Service is rotten and continues to decline in its standards of performance, its professionalism, its ability to execute its constitutional mandate. And Section 205 of the Constitution gives SAPS its constitutional mandate, which is fundamentally to protect South Africans, secure their property, etc. And we believe that SAPS as a national competency is failing in that regard. And it's not just our word that people need to take on board. It's actually the National Police Commissioner who himself in Parliament said that SAPS is incapable of fulfilling its constitutional mandate, which is a terrifying admission of failure. And then against that backdrop, we now have a Minister of Police who's demonstrated his own incompetence in overseeing and managing the South African Police Service, who wants to take firearms away from responsible, law-abiding South Africans for whom it is their last line of defence against violent crime, which is on the rise.
So the week before last, quite recently, you led a debate in Parliament about the chaotic state of the country's DNA database, the samples of evidence we need to get convictions, especially in cases of gender-based violence, to get those criminals convicted. And before that, you tweeted some photos about the chaotic state of the firearms registry and papers lying around all over. And the pressure was on the police minister, and some newspapers even said it's time that Tshepi resigns. Do you think this new gun bill is timed to distract the South African public from the problems faced by a politician who's the Minister of Police?
Yeah, I think that's one element of it. It's the theatre of politics, and Minister Tshepi is an excellent actor within that theatre. He is more interested in performing for the public than he is in actually executing his executive oversight responsibility of the South African Police Service. But one of the key issues is that Minister Tshepi, who used to be the National Police Commissioner, still thinks he is the National Police Commissioner. And so you have this conflation of politics and the administration, which is very dangerous for any government institution, but for the South African African Police Service certainly a critical issue. And I think that's at the heart of this issue. You've got the Minister and the National Police Commissioner fighting with each other while ordinary South Africans suffer. But, back to the point about the DNA issue, and that's been really well covered, I think, in the media, but it's taken us 2 years to get the media to really amplify the devastation that this causes in the criminal justice system and the impact that it has on the prosecution or successful prosecution of cases of some of the most violent criminals in the country. It's actually about the systemic dysfunction of the South African Police Service, because when you go to the Central Firearms Registry, this is not DNA, this is just the administration of firearm licenses. You see the same dysfunction and institutional failure of the South African Police Service. The systems are not working, people are not performing, they're not professional, they're not honest, they're not doing the jobs that they're supposed to do, and so that is now creating a situation where at the moment, people have the right to own a firearm for self-defense, but many people have had to submit their firearms to SAPS during the amnesty period. And because it's taking so long to process firearms, up to 2, 3, 4 years, firearm licenses, people are already being disarmed through the dysfunction of the South African Police Service.
And in a while, we're going to talk about what happens to those firearms that you submit to the SA Police. Tshepi, I want to bring you into this conversation and welcome to the Inside Track. Before we talk about this particular issue, just tell us about your organization, Girls on Fire, and what it stands for.
Well, Girls on Fire was established back in 2015, and it's on the basis of women not becoming victims any longer. We want women to be able to stand for themselves. And the tool we use as an organization is a firearm. It's a tool, as we always say. And we train them to legally use it and be legally licensed. So we take them through the whole aspects. Also, bringing to mind that once you decide to carry a firearm, the burden of all this is carried on you. So we ensure that women are able to protect themselves and they stop being victims. We want women to stand up for themselves, and that is what our organization does.
Great. So you obviously have your own views on this gun bill that the government wants to pass. What, in your view, will this have, if passed onto law? What effect will it have on the fight against crime, but in particular, the fight against gender-based violence?
Number one, in terms of crime, we know very well that the police are ineffective in fighting the crime in this country. We know in recent reports as well that even firearms handed in during amnesty period, that about 9,000, if I'm not mistaken, of them have landed in illegal hands. Now
9,000.
9,000. Now you want your most vulnerable citizens, women, to be at the mercy of criminals, at the mercy of men who are physically larger than women, who cannot fight a physical fight. But with a firearm, we know that women can level the playing field. And you want to take all that away from women. You want to take their ability to fight for their right, their constitutional right to life. I mean, how do you do that? And why would you be protecting more politicians? For what? Why would you do that? And you're leaving your women to be slaughtered in the streets of South Africa. To what end? That's what we want to know. To what end is this going to culminate in?
So you are obviously a very powerful advocate for lawful, licensed firearm ownership. And as you mentioned, it levels the playing field, especially for women who are well trained. And that's what your organization aims to do. But what would you say to the criticism or the voices that say we must reduce the number of firearms in circulation, and that means the number of lawful licensed firearms, because those firearms inevitably end up on the black market? What would you say to that criticism?
Number one, we know for a fact that there's more firearms coming out of SAPS than anywhere else in the country. We know that for a fact. It's not even an argument that the Minister of Police can even come to have. You want your citizens to be disarmed. You want them to be vulnerable. You want them to hand in the legally licensed firearm, by the way, which they are trained, because it doesn't come easy. They're trained to use them. They're trained legally, the theory around it. They are trained to use it, and they know that when push comes to shove, you have a tool at your means, at your disposal to use so that you don't lose your life. Now, he's basically taking away our right to life. It's enshrined in the Constitution, and replacing it with control, because this is exactly what this bill seeks to do. And we are totally against that. We know for a fact that a woman who is abused in the home and can defend herself is better off than a woman who is axed to death, because let's be honest, axes are tools as well that are being used, who are strangled to death, whatever the case may be. But we know that when they have a firearm, that they have something that they can use to either stop that attack on themselves or be able to get out of that situation. And we emphasize that a lot. Now, you're taking away this right. Why would you do that? Why?
Why indeed. Thanks so much, Tshepi, for joining us, and good luck to you and the important work your organization are doing, especially for women. Andrew, I want to pick up on something that Tshepi mentioned. 9,000 firearms stolen from government's firearms registry, the place that people go to hand in for safekeeping their firearms to be destroyed, and yet they end up in the hands of criminals. What's going on here?
Yeah, well, the 9,000 figure is new to me, but I do think it's certainly in the thousands over a period of time. And what we do know for a fact is that every single year SAPS loses hundreds of firearms. And I use the term losers loosely because we know for a fact that members of the South African Police Service have been arrested and successfully prosecuted for selling firearms that belonged to lawful, responsible, law-abiding citizens, but had been possessed by SAPS for whatever reason. Perhaps it was an amnesty, or perhaps there was an investigation and they needed to retain those firearms. Those firearms have been sold to gangs. And we know that. It's widely published. There was a SAPS member, Mr. Prinsloo, who was arrested, prosecuted, and released after serving less than a third of his term. Now, we need to, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but we do need to have a look at the fact that Charles Cilliers, the famous assassination here in the Western Cape, under very tragic circumstances, was investigating these issues. He was one of the officers that was investigating Mr. Prinsloo. And so we start to see the dots connecting around this bill and SAPS's failure to administer the existing legislation to protect the firearms of law-abiding South Africans and its own service pistols from being released onto the streets. And then last week we heard an interview from a gangster outside the Cape Town High Court.
Yes, KFM was speaking to him.
100%. Who said quite unashamedly that we bought our firearms from police officers. I mean, this is the kind of blatant corruption that we see in the South African Police Service, and quite frankly, the intention to remove self-defense as a reason to possess a firearm, amongst other limitations, is a complete smokescreen. It's probably that's the best way to call it. It's a smokescreen to distract us from the failures of SAPS and their role in releasing firearms into criminal hands. It's not the guns that kill people; it's the criminals that kill people. And if SAPS is supplying the tool that they need to kill people, well, then SAPS is responsible. And as Tshepi said, it's not just firearms. In fact, across the three most serious contact crimes, murder, attempted murder, and assault GBH, the number one instrument used in the commission of those three crimes is a knife. The second is a gun, and then it goes down. The third is body parts, cable ties, you name it. Some horrific tools are used. We don't see government chopping off our body parts to prevent murder or serious crime.
Yes. So that is an incredibly powerful argument, which I think the police minister would find very difficult to answer. But Andrew, what is the DA actually doing to stop this gun bill? And what can ordinary people do to help the DA?
Well, we've launched this petition, as you said. It's stopgunbill.co.za, which is really garnering a tremendous amount of support, over 60,000 signatures this morning and climbing. We're really hoping to get to the 70,000 mark before the end of this week. We're also mobilizing civil society and engaging with experts in the field to make sure that this debate is not just about the emotional element, but about the facts and the evidence, because we believe that there's enough facts and evidence to support our argument against the bill. And I think that if we rely purely on the emotional arguments, we'll find ourselves in a very precarious position. So we are analysing the bill clause by clause. We're going to make our own formal submission to the Civilian Secretariat for Police to object to the bill. And we are going to join South African members of the South African public in town hall meetings across the country. We really need to mobilize South Africans, both those who choose to own a firearm and those who don't. Chances are we know someone who's been a victim of a violent crime where they may have been able to protect themselves if they had a firearm. We need to stand up for the people who want to own firearms and in order to protect their right to life and their universal right to self-defense. And one of the most disturbing elements of the bill is contained in its preamble, which is the sort of overarching argument that is moving away from the preservation of individual rights to what there's now been called public interest or in the public good. And I think that we've got a very contemporary example of how government acts in our public interest during the lockdown. Some of the most outrageous bans
They
on
mean
products.
we will determine what the public good is and you must just comply.
Absolutely. So this is absolutely ideological. If you look at the ANC and its obsession with state control, we're starting to see that creep into the firearms control legislation. And then obviously, as I said, they're just completely failing to administer the existing legislation, which is already onerous for firearm owners. It's not easy to get a firearm. I just think that the smokescreen that SAPS is putting up here mustn't distract South Africans from the fundamental issues of corruption within the South African Police Service, which is affecting a whole range of issues. And we need to put up this fight, which we are doing and will continue to do.
Andrew, just give us that website again where people can sign the DA petition.
Stopgunbill.co.za.
Thanks very much, and thanks for joining us. Well, there you have it. The message is one directed not only at firearm owners, licensed and lawful, but also people who have something to protect, who have the option currently in our law to get a gun. This is a very important constitutional fight, and we wish the DA and other organizations fighting it the best of luck. We'll be back right after this. This week in DA-led towns and cities across the country, the DA-led Tshwane delivers on its commitment to open the new Centurion taxi rank. The DA-governed Western Cape on Monday launched an annual tender disclosure report, the first of its kind in South Africa. And over 1,500 residents were recently assisted by the DA-governed Cape Town's 8 specialized substance abuse and addiction clinics. On to this week's DA at Work feature. We are joined by JP Smith, the Mayoral Committee member for Safety and Security in the City of Cape Town. Welcome again to the Inside Track, JP Smith. You are no stranger to the effect that the failure of national government in law enforcement has on communities. But the key question here for us is, what is the city of Cape Town under DA control doing to compensate for this failure by the police?
So I think we understand that there is a barometer of what is a reasonable police deployment in an area. That figure is around 1 to 220. For every 220 or so members of the public, you need a police officer. We have dipped well below those levels in the Western Cape and in Cape Town. From the last figures that were obtained through the Provincial Portfolio Committee on Community Safety, we're sitting at around 1 to 560.
And sorry, JP, the important point there is who makes these decisions? Because ordinary folks see the DA controls the Western Cape and the city of Cape Town, and they think, why does the DA government there not just send more police?
Absolutely. So this is one of the very persistent pains I have, that you go to public meetings. I was on a long debate on Monday night, online debate, and people just don't understand this. They think that because you run Cape Town, because we run the Western Cape, that we control the police, and that's absolutely not the case, obviously. Minister Cilliers and the National Police Commissioner Sitole and the ANC national government run the police. They decide on policing resources. So if you have only one police officer for every 880 members of the public at Harare police station in Cilliers, that's the ANC who has failed you. So what we are doing instead thereof is we are putting in resources on the ground. We looked at the 10 worst police stations in Cape Town, and as a joint venture with the provincial government, we created the LEAP program, the Law Enforcement Advancement Program, and we're putting 1,000 officers into those 10 hotspots, 100 extra officers per hotspot, so that we can try and compensate for that massive shortfall of policing numbers. With that, of course, goes radios, bulletproof vests, uniforms, vehicles, operating budget, overtime. It's a huge amount of expense that runs into the billions. And what is so frustrating is that while we're pouring resources into this policing resources bucket on this side, the ANC national government is scooping it out on the other side by reducing the police budget. Over the next 3 years, we're going to see a reduced police budget. How is that even possible?
Almost as if they wanted law enforcement in the Western Cape to fail.
Well, you only have to look at the comments on some social media and some interviews where people say, well, we understood that there was an operation underway to destabilize Cape Town. There are active attempts at creating a gang environment which is untenable. I mean, how do you have a 2% or 3% conviction rate for gang-related murders in Cape Town? And nowhere does somebody pull the handbrake and say, this is a crisis. We need a massive commission of inquiry. We need a huge overhaul. If that happened in any other city in the world, I've spoken to district attorneys and senior prosecutors and police officers in other countries who say to me, if that happened where they were, there would be a complete overhaul. Heads would roll. Whole departments would change. Heads of detectives and crime intelligence would be sacked. You can't live with a figure like that and pretend it's normal. It's insane. Combine the complete failure of the criminal justice system at the hands of national government with the purposeful and sustained and conscious under-resourcing of the police. And you have the crisis we have in the Cape Flats. And then, of course, the city and the province get blamed for it, although we don't control any of those levers, not SAPS, not the NPA, the DOJ, the DCS. What we can do is, with our much more limited powers at Metro Police and law enforcement level, push in resources, and we're also compensating for some of those other failures through specialized units, the Gang and Drug Task Team, the Rail Unit, Marine Unit, all these other specialized units, liquor enforcement, metal theft enforcement, things we aren't supposed to be doing, but which we are compelled to do, because at the hands of national government, those things are failing dramatically. So we're having to do the specialized enforcement, the functional specialization. We're even creating a strategic information management service to start gathering more information and manage it more intelligently, so we can enforce intelligently and be prosecutorially orientated. And of course, we've got our Safety and Security Investigations Unit, 37 detectives being hired to support those LEAP units, because it doesn't help you clocking up more and more arrests with your LEAP staff in that area for firearms, drugs, gang high flyers, etc. And those cases are going nowhere and they're failing. You have to get convictions up, because you can't make a permanent blue barrier between the good and the bad people. You actually have to start taking some of the bad people out of circulation.
So the DA doesn't just complain about what is wrong, we get things done. Here is a video of the LEAP program that JP referred to and how it's being implemented in the community of Bonteheuwel in the city of Cape Town.
So right now we're literally in the center of Cape Town in a community called Bontiville. We are about 85,000 people that live in this area. Bontiville had a very, very high murder rate because of our lack of policing in the area. On a daily basis, we were losing people to gang violence.
We were infected and inflicted with gang violence.
Our kids couldn't even play in peace in the park. I was actually very scared even to leave my home. Constantly, I will say constantly living in fear.
For a city or a government to be effective in fighting crime, you need around one police officer for every 220 members of the public. At the moment, Cape Town, in terms of SAPS resources, is sitting around 1 to every 560. The LEAP program by the city and the province is an attempt to compensate for those very low SAPS deployment figures in those areas where it matters most. In the 10 most affected crime hotspots, we are deploying 100 officers each with the goal of halving the murder rate, seriously improving the safety, and thereby allowing investment, job creation, and the normalization of community life in those areas.
LEAP's brought about high levels of law enforcement visibility in the area. Where there was no visibility, we now have visibility at key times.
Before we had this program, there were days when I dreaded even getting up. But afterwards, I felt safe because, I could be walking down the street or crossing the road or down Bontiville Avenue, and I would see 5 law enforcement vehicles in that time just passing me by, which made me feel safer.
What we need to do here is be visible, to patrol, to build relationships with communities, to act on tip-offs, to be responsive, to attend to hotspots.
We set up street WhatsApp groups in every single street of this community. So whenever there were issues, whenever things went wrong, whenever there was a problem, we were able to immediately report these issues through.
Look where we're standing today. We're standing here. We walked all the way from the center. We weren't robbed. We weren't accosted. Nothing happened to us. Here's young people out. Here's old people out. Joggers passed us.
So LEAP is not just about 100 law enforcement officers coming to an area. LEAP is about bringing communities together. LEAP's about building relationships where relationships were broken before.
None of this would have been possible if it hadn't to be for LEAP and the law enforcement officers.
So we need to see more local community leaders engaging the program, understanding the program, and being able to communicate with community and the officers to ensure that the programs actually become successful.
Wow, how desperately we need those good stories in this country, Tshepi. So through LEAP, you want to deploy 1,000 law enforcement officers in crime hotspots by October. And this was announced quite some time ago. How many have you deployed to date?
So the first 500 are down. We've got them in our 5 worst policing precincts with the highest murder rates. The next 250 have signed their contracts. They're about to go live in July. And then by October, the remaining 250 will be deployed, will be at the first 1,000. And we're hoping that we so dazzle with the outcomes of the project that budget is found for the next 1,000 and the next 1,000 after that. Because if I look at what we're achieving with the results every day, the firearms they're taking off, the arrests they're making, the interventions they're making, then I can see that if we had more of this, we could make so much more of an impact. And then when you hear that national government is reducing police budgets, you think, well, this is so painful because at this very moment we're trying to get these extra resources. The other side is reducing it. And I think it's important to add, we're not just thinking that additional police itself is going to make the change. In all of these nodes, the city has a mayoral urban regeneration program that Mayor Plato has driven very hard, has found substantial budget for. So we're also making the infrastructure investments, the social development programs investments, support for neighborhood watches. That's how we've gotten to 50,000 neighborhood watch members in this city, half of which are formally registered. How we're supporting our law enforcement auxiliary service, all these about almost 600 law enforcement reservists, the only city in South Africa with a police reserve service, and the other interventions we're making through MERP that's helping make investments in those communities so you can attract jobs, you can attract other normalized community activity because you won't just heal the community with police.
So, JP, the DA often talks about the devolution of power. It's a technical term. Many people don't understand what it means. But before you explained the differences in powers and responsibilities between national government that controls the police budget and the deployment of the police, local authorities, and then provincial government. Explain to us this issue of devolution and why it is key in a place like the Western Cape, in Cape Town, under competent DA government, for more policing power and functions and resources to be devolved?
I think the answer is evident. If you have a national government perfectly executing its policing function and its crime prevention function, which is their core constitutional mandate, we wouldn't need to be part of the equation. But if you're not, the expectation must be there that you reach out. This morning's chaos in Nyanga, at the Nyanga taxi rank, I was there just before 6 a.m. and we watched rogue taxis attack private transport vehicles. That operation was largely stocked, especially initially, by traffic law enforcement and Metro Police. SAPS belatedly arrived on the scene. Much to my frustration, we're taking that up now with the provincial commissioner, or the acting provincial commissioner. It's a difficult situation to accept. But we have, over time, realized we can't just wait for somebody else to fix it. Hence the Strategic Information Management Service, hence our Safety and Security Investigations thing, hence reaching out to additional functions like metal theft, our metal theft unit, the marine enforcement, the rail enforcement, the marine enforcement's additional powers that we got from DAF and otherwise. So everywhere where we can, whether we are writing additional provisions in the Provincial Liquor Act to empower our staff to enforce liquor legislation, or whether we're acquiring additional powers from the Second-Hand Goods Act through the National Minister, or even lobbying successfully to have the powers of law enforcement officers amended across the whole of South Africa, which I'm still amazed we achieved. That has upped the game a lot for our city municipal peace officers and all the municipalities. The entire South Africa has benefited from that intervention because all those municipal peace officers across the country now have those additional powers. They're not all using it yet, but they have those additional powers. So we haven't waited to be gifted anything. We've pushed as hard as we can in anticipation of the day when we successfully succeed in devolving the whole policing function from national government to provincial government, or of course for me ideally to local government, because I know we can do a better job of it.
So the strategy is not just to talk about federalism and devolved powers, but to push for them, to fill the gaps left by national government, and then to make the arguments and to point to the successes.
Well, I mean, the Public Administration Management Act, in fact, talks about this exchange of functions. If a sphere of government is incapable of effectively rendering its function, at some point there must be legal action, intergovernmental dispute action, such as Province has taken against national government to correct the disastrously low levels of police deployment in places like Nyanga, Khayelitsha, Mitchell's Plain, Delft, and everywhere else. But at some point we must make then a legal challenge to start securing the right to run a police service from a sphere of government that is capable of effecting proper oversight, that is capable of holding staff accountable for brutality and cruelty. You cannot have a situation where you look at the IPID figures and you're not sure of who the bad guys are in this equation. Those bad police elements are giving the entire service a bad name, and they're destroying the morale of the many good people in SAPS who are desperately trying to keep communities safe and do the right thing. So absolutely, we must continue to push for the devolution. I do not see national government in the foreseeable future being able to do a meaningfully competent job around policing. This has to be devolved. And I think at some point very soon we are going to have to ask the entire South Africa to join us in this fight to devolve policing powers, or we will all suffer the collective consequences.
And it's not just about the Western Cape. In other provinces where the DA takes over, implements alternative policies, you can make the same case within time as things are built up, to say, please devolve these functions, let us succeed where national government is failing.
It was notable in Johannesburg under the mayoral committee member for safety and security, Michael Sun, that one of the first things he pursued was a substantial increase in the number of Metro Police officers. So we wherever we govern, we understand that this is a critical thing. Equally, the modernization, a big part of the crisis in our policing service is the massive lack of modernization. The National Development Plan ages ago already spelled out the desperate need for adequate numbers of detectives, the demilitarization of the police, which is the exact opposite of what SAPS has been driven to under the ANC, and modernization, getting laptops available with internet connections so your staff can competently function, modern systems, proper access to CCTV. National government makes no contribution to CCTV. Where they have access to CCTV, they plug into what local government is supplying. They've not contributed financially. Things like gunfire detection, which are technologies used elsewhere in the world, has been driven by the city belatedly, or even absent the SAPS's involvement. We've tried to make this work. So So we've tried to modernize, we've tried to use every available tool to be successful, whether it's the harnessing of reservists through your law enforcement auxiliary program or the mass mobilization of community members through neighborhood watches. We've tried to use every possible tool, especially where it doesn't break the bank and doesn't ask for additional budget, because the policing budget that we allocate to safety and security is the same budget that's being competed for by housing, parks maintenance, road maintenance, water and electricity. So that's a finite budget, and we're dipping into our budget that runs in millions, where we are trying to fund a service that national government is supposed to be funding with its billions.
Yeah, and that way we get things done. And thanks so much, Tshepi, for joining us again, and best of luck with this important fight. The takeaway seems to be that effective mayors and provincial governments can protect communities against the failure of national government. We don't all need to be tied to the chaos within the ANC, and we can vote to make a difference and to get things done. We'll be back right after this. That's a wrap. The first and only registration weekend for elections this year is fast approaching on 17 and 18 July. If you are not registered to vote or you've moved house since 2019, this will be your only chance to make sure you can vote later this year. Don't miss out. Visit check.da.org.za to check your registration status. Until next time, stay strong, South Africa.